Everything has been said about Rome, but it is understood that it is far from everything. This empire gave the world laws, roads, a military machine and architecture, but behind its facade, shadows remained. Vanished cults, undeciphered prophecies, buildings that cannot be explained. Under the streets of ancient Rome, ritual premises were hidden into which even the emperor had no right to enter. Some temples are oriented to the stars, which are not visible from Earth. In the Colosseum, a hall was found that had neither an entrance nor an acoustic logic, and the legions that disappeared without a fight became part of the legends that official history prefers not to look into. In this video, we will analyze 20 real mysteries of the Roman Empire, which even after a millennium continue to confuse researchers and archaeologists. From temples without gods to machines that were ahead of their time. From texts that were forbidden to be read aloud to cults of which not a single image remains. We will delve into that side of Rome that is not written about in school textbooks, the side that was deliberately left beyond comprehension. And the deeper you look into it, the less it seems that it ever disappeared. The video sequence in this issue is purely for atmosphere and may not match the story, so whatever you do, tune in to listen and enjoy your viewing. Sibylline books, texts that could not be read to the end. In the very heart of Rome, under the foundations of one of the most ancient hills, the Capitol, for centuries there was an object to which even those who ruled the world obeyed. These were the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies that no one could read without the permission of the Senate, no one, not even the emperor. They were feared, but at the same time, they were turned to at the most critical moments, during wars, epidemics, disasters. No one knew exactly what they contained, but one thing was clear: every line could change the decision of the whole of Rome. According to legend, the books were brought to King Tarquinius the Proud by an ancient Sibyl, a priestess from Cameo, dressed in shadow and speaking in riddles. She offered to sell 9 scrolls to the king. He refused, considering the price too high. Then she burned 3 and offered again. He refused again. She burned 3 more and offered the remaining 3 at the same price. And only then did Tarquin realize that each burned scroll does not devalue the remaining scrolls, but makes them unique. He agreed. These 3 books marked the beginning of an archive that Rome would fear more than any enemy. Sibylline books were hidden in the Temple of Jupiter Capitol. Their content was not published. When there was a threat, fire, flood, eclipse, uprising, the Senate appointed a special board of priests who opened books and interpreted passages. Not everything, only what is allowed. These prophecies were not perceived as superstition, but as a legally significant recommendation, binding to action. According to them, sacrifices were appointed, holidays were postponed, and military campaigns were even canceled. Mystery has become a state mechanism. It is not known what exactly these texts contained, but fragments, indirect quotations which are repeated in late Roman literature, have been preserved. Formulas built as a warning are often found in them. When the 9th does not return, consider that the shadow has come forward. The seal will remain intact until the time does not renounce the name. Do not open until the smoke turns golden. These phrases cannot be accurately interpreted, but they appeared in completely different chronicles, in letters, inscriptions, and sometimes in private diaries. It was as if the language of books seeped into everyday life, and someone continued to rewrite them, just like miasms which cannot be stopped but can be felt. In 83 BC, the Temple of Jupiter burned down. The fire destroyed not only statues and gold, but also books. It is believed that this was an accident. But one of the chroniclers, Lucius Cornelius Sisenna, writes about the fire that started not from outside but from inside the walls where no one kept oil or torches. Too deep, too precise. After the fire, the Senate began to collect new texts, Sibyl prophecies throughout Italy. They were brought from Erythra, Hergus, Phrygia, even from Syria. They were drilled, cleaned, rewritten. A new collection was created. It was again forbidden to read the Ego without a sanction, but not for long. In 405 AD, Emperor Honorius and the Christian Senate decided to destroy the Sibylline books. The official reason is pagan character, but the second version survived in private letters. They say that some of the texts cross the line of what is permissible and contain prophecies that violate chronology. If this is true, then the text contained information that was perceived not as mysticism, but as a threat to the historical order. Question: If the books were destroyed, why did their language continue to exist? Why do separate phrases appear in Probus, Macrobius, and Pliny? Why do the chronicles of late Rome contain formulas that are not characteristic of Latin poetics, but coincide in structure with the prophetic things of the East? Some researchers assume that the books were never completely destroyed. Part could be hidden, probably transferred to the Alexandria Library. There is a hypothesis that the underground vaults under the Palatine were used not only as ritual spaces, but also as an archive that could be returned to, and maybe they came back. There are documents in which secret readings are mentioned in the times of Augustus and Trajan, not public, not sanctioned by the Senate. Perhaps the emperors, especially in moments of instability, addressed the texts directly, without intermediaries. They broke the rules. They looked for something in the lines that did not belong to the world of the gods, but rather to the structure of time, and maybe they found it. The Sibylline books are not just an ancient collection. This is a monument to civilization's fear of knowledge that can not just predict, but change the structure of reality. That is why they were destroyed, not because they were pagans, and because they were dangerous. And if some of them still exist somewhere, perhaps there is someone who continues to read them, not for salvation, and to check, where is the border between prophecy and the architecture of the future? Temple of Mithras, the god feared too late. During the Roman Empire, mysterious underground sanctuaries began to be built all over Europe. They were small, without windows, carved underground or in the rock, always with one entrance and complex internal geometry. These temples were called Mithraeums, and they worshipped a god who was not in the official pantheon. Ego's name was Mitra. No Roman source explains where he came from. Ego was not mentioned in state sacrifices. He did not figure in imperial holidays, but he was everywhere. According to archaeologists, in the 3rd century, Mithraism spread to dozens of provinces, from Britain to Syria. Ego temples were found under pitchforks, amphitheaters, barracks, but the main thing is that women were not allowed in them, and no one, except the initiates, knew what was happening inside. In the center of each Mithraeum stood a scene, a bas-relief depicting Mithras killing a bull. His mantle fluttered, his gaze was turned upwards. Snakes, dogs, and crows are nearby. The bull's blood fell on the ground, and life was born from it. But no one explained what this image means. Not a single source of that time provides a decipherment. And yet Mithraism became one of the most influential closed religions of the empire, competing with Christianity. Historians claim that the cult of Mithras originated in Persia, but the Persian Mithras, the god of peace and agreement, is not at all similar to the Roman one. There he was sunny and public. Here, underground and secret. Only the name is between them. As if someone took a figure from someone else's mythology and put a completely different essence into it. One is impossible for discussion. The degrees of initiation have been preserved. There were 7 of them in total, from raven to father. At each level, initiates performed rituals that no one else has recreated. Only descriptions, ablutions, silent, bloody sacrifice, no records. Only sculptures duplicating the same gesture, hand pressed to heart, eyes closed. Later Christian church fathers called Mithraism a false world and a twin of truth. Some directly wrote, Mithra knew that Christ was coming, and therefore he preceded him. The strangest thing is that the vast majority of Mithraeums were deliberately covered up and sealed. In some, archaeologists found traces of destruction, but not violence. Stacked stones, neatly closed niches, cleanly cut entrances. As if the followers of Mithras themselves destroyed their sanctuaries, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Perhaps because something in these temples had to remain underground. One Mithraeum in Ostia was excavated in the 20th century. A rare anomaly was discovered in it. The stone benches had traces of repeated heating as if someone had sat on them, radiating heat. The walls were polished from the inside, and there was a hole in the ceiling that coincided with the position of Sirius on certain days of the year. And the most inexplicable thing is that there was nothing on the central plate, where the bas-relief should have been. The stone was smooth, and in the center of the ego there is only the imprint of a human palm, not cut out. Imprinted in the structure of the material, as if it had arisen at the moment when the stone had not yet cooled. But the analysis showed, the breed is ancient, millions of years old. The cult disappeared suddenly, for several decades, too fast to be a natural disappearance. All that remained were empty Mithraeums and shadows of symbols that no one had deciphered. Some researchers are confident. Mithraism has not disappeared. He left, or fell silent. perhaps because what he brought no longer required people, or found other carriers. And if someone ever decides to restore one of the rituals, starting with a simple sign of a bull, perhaps he will not revive the cult. He will return the channel. And this is no longer a religion. This is a structure. And such things do not forgive mistakes. The legion that didn't come back. The 9th Legion of the Roman Empire, Legio IX Hispana, was one of the most formidable and respected military formations of its time. He participated in the conquests of Gaul, suppressed the uprising in Spain and Britain, served under the command of Julius Caesar himself. His story is a journey through blood, iron, and discipline, and at the same time, it is one of the darkest secrets about which even the imperial chronicles were silent. For the first time, the riddle arose in Britain at the beginning of the 2nd century. The 9th Legion, based in the fortress of Eboracum, modern York, suddenly disappears from all records. Before that, there are regular mentions, salaries, supplies, change of command, and then silence, complete absence. We didn't report, we ordered transfers, we followed disbandment. It was as if the entire legion had dissolved. Later, in the 20th century, scientists proposed a version. The 9th Legion was destroyed in Britain during the uprising of local tribes. But there are no archaeological data or mass burials to confirm this. Not a single corpse, not a single shield with the designation of the 9th was found. Even the coins that the legionnaires always carried with them did not turn up in the excavations. More than one person has disappeared. The entire structure has disappeared, with standards, archives, warehouses, and the legion emblem. Some historians claim that part of the legion could have been transferred to Germany, but then the question arises, why does his name not appear in any records in the Rhenish legions? Why are there no mixed squads? Rome did not lose armies without a trace. Every penny, every weapon carrier was counted, and the disappearance of such a scale, even if it was shameful, had to be documented. Instead, there is emptiness. For the first time, the mystery of the 9th was widely discussed in the 19th century, when British scientists began to study the tablets found in Vindeland. These tablets, the correspondence of Roman officers on wooden boards, suddenly break off precisely at the mention of sending reinforcements to the Nivan Legion. The last tablet ends with the phrase, "If by that time the gate will be still open, send a flag, but not people." The phrase is strange, Goal. What gate? Why is the sign more important than people? And why precisely from this moment, not only the Legion itself, but also its mention disappears? Some researchers put forward a more mystical version. Perhaps the Legion was sent not to suppress the uprising, but to perform a special task, to protect or capture an object that was not subject to public notice. Maybe the Romans faced something that could not be explained within the framework of the traditional world. Artifact, temple, cult, knowledge. And perhaps contact with him did not mean death, but disappearance, not physical and structural. There are assumptions that the Legion participated in a ritual connected with the northern cult, which was worshipped by the Celts on the border of the Pictish lands, a ceremony in which the role of the army is not to be a defender, but a victim. This is not confirmed, but in the area of the disappearance of Naidi, strange signs are still found. Rings laid out of black basalt, which is not typical for these lands, and columns standing at an angle to the horizon. Locals consider it sleeping times, and still one detail is particularly disturbing. In the manuscripts of the monastery in Lindisfarne, written already in the 7th century, there is a passage describing the arrival of a dark column dressed in gold, but without faces. The monk writes that during these days, the sun did not touch the earth and time went backwards, and no one knew what day it was the day before. Coincidence? Or a trace of memory left in the cultural fabric 500 years after the disappearance? Some are sure. The 9th was not destroyed. He was taken out of time. Perhaps Rome himself initiated it, as part of an experiment or ritual. The empire, obsessed with control, could decide on a step in which the army becomes not an instrument of power, but a connecting link between realities. A kind of lock, the last seal. And if this is so, then the 9th Legion is an army that has not disappeared, and the structure still slumbering somewhere on the edge of the world. And when the gate opens again, maybe they will be the first to pass through it. Temples without gods. Archaeologists have found temples throughout the territory of the former Roman Empire. The multitude, some were destroyed, others were partially preserved, and others were turned into churches or secular buildings. But there is a special category of buildings that give goosebumps not because of the architecture, but because of the silence. These are temples in which there are no images of gods, no inscriptions, no altars. Temples that literally have no purpose. They are called sacred voids, and there are dozens of them. The first thing that catches your eye is geometry. These buildings are built with jewel-like precision, perfectly symmetrical halls, fine acoustics in some places, zone fields where the voice disappears, even if you shout. The plans of these temples, as a rule, are oriented not to the sun, not to the cardinal points, but to unknown axes. Sometimes to a point where nothing happens, sometimes on a piece of land that does not give a magnetic reaction. And the main thing is that it is impossible to attribute them to a specific cult. They are not dedicated to Jupiter, Venus, Mars. They do not look like Mithraic sanctuaries. They have no traces of sacrifices. There are no canonical forms of columns. These buildings are like architectural containers, but what they contained is unclear. Or who? In one of these temples, in Syracuse, archaeologists found a strange feature. The central hall, carved in limestone, had walls covered with the smallest depressions. As it turned out later, they coincided with the resonance system. If you pronounce a sound of a certain frequency, these niches begin to vibrate. No Roman text describes a similar use of architecture. But as a result of the experiment, it was possible to record a strange effect. The sound, once started, continued to fluctuate for up to 15 minutes. No repetition, without amplifiers. Some people believe that these churches are an instrument, conscious perhaps connected not with worship, but with perception, as if these were places where they did not pray, but waited. They did not talk, but listened. They did not turn to the gods, but accepted what came. An even more mysterious structure was discovered in southern Gaul. There, under the fortress of the time of Augustus, they found a hall carved into the rock, with a strictly round room and 3 steps leading down. Below is a niche in which something clearly once stood, but what is not clear? There are no traces attached. There is no channel for submissions, no image. But on the floor there is an engraved spiral that goes under the stone. Underground scanning showed that the spiral continues to a depth of more than 6 meters, but it is impossible to excavate it. It is located inside a monolithic slab. Some researchers call these temples corridors of silence. Perhaps they were built not as cult spaces, but as protective ones. Protection is not from enemies, but from knowledge, from what should not have come out, or, on the contrary, that which should not have disappeared completely. There is a version that these were tanks, not for water, not for storage, but for memory, not in the human sense, and how to capture a state that is not tied to language, and that sometimes, with certain weather or sound, this recording is turned on. There were cases when tourists inside such temples began to feel events that did not happen to them. They saw unfamiliar scenes, heard phrases they did not understand, felt anxiety for no reason. This is not superstition. This is a phenomenon recorded in Egypt, India, and some ancient mosques. All these buildings have one more common feature. The entrance to them is often hidden behind a layer of stone, or is completely absent, as if no one was supposed to go inside, or as if those who are inside should not come out. In Rome, there are drawings that show non-existent buildings, a temple on paper, in reality nothing. But when scanning these areas of land, sharp drops in soil density are recorded. No catacombs, just emptiness. It is as if the architecture was cut out of the space itself and then removed, not physically and conceptually, and yet it is felt. These temples are not a memory, and not religion. They are, as it were, a frozen point in the fabric of time, a question that no one dared to ask. Perhaps precisely because they knew, anyone who asks it will not receive an answer. He will receive only presence, and it will remain. Forgotten cars of Rome. When we talk about the technologies of the Roman Empire, the first thing that comes to mind is roads, aqueducts, arches, simple, clear, engineering elegant. But there were other designs, the one whose appointment causes questions even today. In archaeological reports, they are listed as mechanisms of undetermined use, or more simply, machines that do not fit into the context of their time. In 1901, during excavations on the slope of the Palatine Hill, a fragment of a bronze gear was found. At first, they thought it was a water wheel, but upon further analysis, it became clear. The angles of the teeth, the material, the ratio of the sides, all this is not characteristic of Roman water engineering. This gear was part of a much more complex device. Later, scientists tried to restore a possible structure. It turned out a mechanism with a double counter of revolutions, a switching cycle, and a balancing part. It is unknown what he thought, but he was clearly not pumping water. There is an opinion that this was an astronomical device, not as complex as the Antikythera mechanism, but not primitive either. However, the date established by deposits is confusing. 1st century BC. It's too early, too accurate, and too locally. Neither before nor after such details were found in this region. The second case is a find in Ostia. There, among the ruins of a Roman warehouse, a system of canals was discovered that did not lead to the sea. Inside them are traces of lead partitions with neat holes similar to filters. Engineers who studied the design came to the conclusion that the system worked as a kind of racing chamber, but not for water. No traces of organic matter were found. However, the temperature of the walls was higher than that of other objects around. Even centuries later, it was as if the structure itself retained the ultimate heat. And then one researcher admitted, what if this was a technical system for capturing smells, vapors, or sounds? We are used to the fact that in Rome everything served a practical purpose. But this is a modern assumption. We do not have a single, complete drawing. There are no factories, instructions, or those who created these machines. Only pieces. And these pieces do not add up to a useful object. They create an image of something that looks more like sensors, reactors, surveillance cameras, not in the digital sense, and in the sense of perception of the environment. In Naples, a huge lens cut from a single piece of quartz was found in the dungeons. There are no signs of fastening on it. It is not fixed, but perfectly centered in the niche. Light falling through a narrow hole in the ceiling is focused directly into the center of this lens on certain days of the year. Not for image, for concentration. Under it is a small reservoir, but there is nothing in it. Only smooth glass, no ashes, no dust, as if it cleans itself. Such objects are called non-functional artifacts. This is a convenient term to admit. We don't understand why they are. But if you collect them in one row, another picture is formed. A picture of systems that do not interact with a person directly but seem to record his presence, not as a user, but as a trigger. There are no levers inside. There are no handles. Everything works either by itself or not at all. The Romans believed that some forms of matter have a will of their own. The Chronicles describe stones that refuse to be laid, columns that change color when soldiers approach, statues that resonate with an echo that was not there. It was considered part of the world. And perhaps these machines were not for control, but for connection. Between what and what, it's hard to say. But one of the preserved inscriptions in Pompeii sounds like this. When the ring closes, the mechanism will hear again. Too poetic? It is possible. But why do such inscriptions appear only next to architectural anomalies? Why are these mechanisms most often found not in temples and not in workshops, but in border zones, between the city and the void, between the light and the shadow? Some theories claim that these objects could be part of a synchronized network, possibly associated with astronomical cycles, or with sound vibrations, or with what would now be called energy grids. But then we must admit, Rome knew more than we think, and not everything he built was intended for us. And maybe some of these machines are still working. We just forgot how to look at them. Talking statues. In Roman culture, statues were everywhere. They filled squares, stood in temples, decorated forums, houses, even thermal baths. They were made with perfect detailing, striving not only to reflect the appearance, but also to consolidate the presence. They were not decorations, but bearers of power, memory, and sometimes strange functions. Because some of them, according to contemporaries, spoke. The figures to which this applies have come to be called talking statues, lat statuae loquentes. There were several such in Rome. The most famous is Pasquino, whose history as an object of street satire began in the Middle Ages. People left notes with scathing texts near her, as if the statue was speaking to them on its behalf. But in the archives, there are mentions of much older talking statues that disappeared long before Pasquino was born. Suetonius also wrote about them, and then Apollonius of Tyana. In 96 BC on the field of Mars, a statue was discovered that made a sound similar to speech if certain names were pronounced next to it. In response to them came not a clear voice, but a vibration transmitted to the body. This effect was recorded not only by priests, but also by ordinary soldiers. The Roman historian Varro pointed out that on certain days, you could get a sign from some sculptures if you asked a question in your mind. Neither auditory hallucinations nor hallucinations at all. It was described as a feeling of dissolution, a sudden clarity of thought that occurred in the presence of an object. Later, Christians will call it demonic echoes. The most disturbing case is connected with the Temple of Concordia. There was a statue of the goddess made of unusual dark marble. In the Chronicle of Macrobius, it is said that once, when the temple was closed for restoration, 3 workers heard hoarse singing. They did not find the source, but the sound was repeated the next morning, exactly at the same time. Then, when disassembling the pedestal, a cavity was found under the base, in which stood an empty bronze vessel with a pattern in the form of a spiral. His appointment has not been established. When they tried to move the vessel, it crumbled. Since then, the temple has become a place to be avoided. Nowadays, archaeologists sometimes find statues with internal cavities, difficult for the bronze technologies of that time. Some have holes leading into the void. It is assumed that this was resonant acoustics, an ancient acoustic game, possibly used to enhance the effect of presence. But in Roman sources, there is a phrase that sounds most often next to the mention of such objects. Non responde voce sed modo. They answer not with their voice, but with their manner. There is a guess that some statues did not simply depict a deity, but were designed as contact nodes. They were placed in places of energy intersection, for example, in temples built on old Etruscan lines, and activated on the right day. But no sacrifice was required for activation. The presence of a person with a specific condition was required. Don't believe it, not by name. And the internal structure, perhaps with a certain emotional frequency. Approaching, he turned on the statue. A figure with holes matching the height of a human chest was found at the Forum of Boaria. During the study, it turned out that inside it, there is a cavity lined with a smooth stone. But it is impossible to get to it. The mechanism is closed by a massive pedestal, which was forbidden to disassemble because of the risk of destroying the monument. Nevertheless, the devices showed that a stable temperature and a weak but constant electromagnetic field are maintained inside, not metal from the material itself. And then a hypothesis arose. Perhaps these statues were not things, but interfaces, not idols, not forms, and the points of contact with those that Rome did not call with words, with what was simply called noumen, force, manifestation. This is not God. This is an action. They didn't speak, but at the right moment they responded to those who were ready to hear, and maybe, in some places, they still answer. Distorted calendar. At first glance, the Roman calendar is a model of order. The months are named, the days are numbered, the holidays are defined down to the details. But the deeper you study the structure of time in Rome, the clearer it becomes. This order is a mask. Because the very principle of counting time in the empire was repeatedly distorted, on purpose, and each time, for reasons that were either not explained or explained too late. The most famous case is the reform of Julius Caesar. In 46 BC, he introduced the Julian calendar to bring the chaotic Roman lunar reckoning of days into line with the sun. But in order for the leveling to work, that hour lasted 445 days. It was called the last year of confusion. And this name is not a joke, because after it, a strange thing started to happen. Some dates began to repeat themselves, not literally. And in the sense, the same events began to happen in the same number of different years, as if they were in a loop. People wrote, "He died on the same day as his father, although we did not notice." Or, "I swore on a secular holiday, but it turned out that today is a day of mourning." Later, Augustus made a new amendment. He renamed the month Sextilis to Augustus, and added a day to it so that it would not be shorter than the month of Caesar, Julius. But this caused a shift in holidays, and in some places, the days of the gods ended up in unsuitable positions. In the Roman calendar, the days did not just go in order. Each day belonged to some god. If the deity found himself on a foreign bottom, what the priests called confusio, temporary confusion, occurred when the world did not recognize itself. Records have been preserved of cases when people got lost between days. One holiday in the morning, another in the evening. Guards changed twice. Babies were born on a day that was absent the next hour. Later, this phenomenon was explained by calculation errors. But some writers thought otherwise. One of them, who lived at the time of Tiberius, wrote, "A day is not something that follows another day. It is an eye that opens according to a contract. And if the contract is broken, it sees everything at once." The very word calendar comes from calendy, the day when the debt books started counting anew. The calendar was connected not only with time, but also with duty, order, and obligation. What if at some point Rome realized that the very method of measuring time became an element of power and ritual? There is evidence that in some temples the priests kept alternative calendars that did not coincide with the official one. One of them, found in Tivoli, contained months whose names do not correspond to either Greek or Latin sources. It contains such words as trisactus, limen, reversio. What are months, ritual stages, or states of time that do not fit into a linear model? The most mysterious thing is that the Roman calendar was officially updated only with the help of special formulas written on tablets and pronounced on a strictly determined day. These formulas were not part of the civil process. They were sacra, that is, sacred. If the formula was not pronounced, the hour could not start, that is, time itself did not pass. It turned on, and if no one turned it on, everything around continued to live, but it didn't count, and in the pause. One of the most disturbing cases is connected with 158 AD, when an anomaly occurred in the fasts, state list of holidays. The day of Idus Martii was recorded twice, March 15th. In Roman culture, this is a day associated with the assassination of Caesar and a turning point in fate. Many strange things happened that year: mass disappearances in Liguria, strange outbreaks of light in the south, and a series of suicides among officials who served in the calendar commission. All this was attributed to the difficult astrological hour. But in private letters, another is mentioned. We went forward, but everything came back. I lived the day that had already been, and no one noticed it. If we recognize that the calendar is not just a bill, but an interface for interaction with reality, then a failure in it is not an error, but an event. Perhaps there were schools in Rome, the priests of which did not just compile the calendar, but served the course of time, leading it along the necessary trajectory, like a conductor. Perhaps the holidays were not dates, but synchronization points, and if you miss them, something can go out, or come back. And then, every time the calendar changed, someone disappeared, not literally. And what if he was crossed out from the time system? He was still alive, but it no longer coincided with the course of events. And maybe there were more such people than we think. It's just that they did not go to death, but to failure. Disappeared names. In ancient Rome, everything had a name. Every house, god, street, moon, even wind from a certain direction. The name was not just a designation, but a form of existence. It was believed that without a name, a thing cannot be perceived, and even more so, cannot interact with others. But despite all the Romans' love for fixation, in the history of the empire there is a phenomenon of disappeared names. Terms that existed, had an influence, were used in documents, but over time, disappeared without a trace. Without translations, without rethought, they simply ceased to exist, and in some cases, as if they were deliberately crossed out. One of the most puzzling examples is the name of a city that does not exist, which appears in several sources from the Trajan era. In military reports, a certain Colonia 5 is mentioned, but the full name is not deciphered anywhere. One of the inscriptions says that 3 cohorts came out of it that did not return and were not recognized. This colony is not present on any geographical map or in the lists of provinces, but the remnants of the road leading to nowhere exist, and to this day they are called Via Omissa, the road that is not remembered. There are many similar cases. In temple inscriptions there are names of gods that are not found anywhere else: Centaur, Praxian, Thesra. It is impossible to identify them either with Greek counterparts or with local cults. Some inscriptions are accompanied by the wording, a name that is pronounced once, and then the question, were these goddesses and gods, or something else that could be called but could not be repeated? In the library of Emperor Tiberius, according to Tacitus, there were tablets with recalled names, those who were sentenced to damnatio memoriae, that is, the curse of memory. But in some of these tablets, which were found fragmentarily, the names of objects, altars, even seasons are recorded, not people. For example, there is a mention of Hod Noxialis, which is not in any list. It is said about him, "In him the light did not come, and no one remembered the birth." There is a hypothesis that names in Rome could be closed channels. If the name is repeated too often, it draws power. If it is too rare, it becomes unstable. Therefore, some gods had 2 names. One was public, the other was arcane, which only priests knew. The most famous is with Jupiter. In later vocabulary, his second name is found, stator, which means holding. Some believe that this is not an epithet, but an alternative essence. Almost nothing is known about her, except for the phrase, "Stater does not come, it remains." But there were also names that were not translated, were not inflected, and were not used aloud. They were written down as a sequence of symbols, sometimes mirrored, sometimes in the form of geometric shapes. One of the most famous artifacts of this kind is the stone from Eritrea, where 27 symbols that do not belong to any alphabet are carved. The stone was located in a temple of unknown purpose. When they tried to move it in the 19th century, the wagon cracked, then the floor cracked, and then the stone disappeared. There are no traces left, only an engraving with a drawing, and on it is the last line, written under the drawing by the hand of the owner. The name has returned to itself. The phenomenon of missing names is especially evident in the Roman colonies. In some of them there is no mention of temples, but strange round buildings without doors are found, inside of which there is a grid of letters mixed with signs on the walls. Researchers call them sound memory spaces, places where perhaps names were pronounced that were not fixed in writing but activated by repetition, as if the name was not data but an event. And if it was pronounced, then it could no longer be separated from the person who uttered it. In the philosophy of the Stoics, popular in late Rome, there was an idea: a true name can only be used once, because everything else is not knowledge, but repetition. This idea seemed abstract until it became clear that some Roman rites actually included the act of pronouncing a name, which was immediately crossed out. It was not a curse, it was a seal. Today, such names are tried to be reconstructed according to the context. But perhaps the point is precisely that they cannot be restored, because they did not disappear. They went to a region where the name no longer calls, but watches. Walking walls. In 1985, while carrying out construction work in the basement of an old building on the territory of ancient Ostia Antica, workers discovered a fragment of a wall that did not match the style and material of the rest of the structures. The marble block, encrusted with an unknown green rock, fit perfectly into the brickwork, but there was emptiness beneath it. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found a room not marked on any of the plans. Inside, smooth walls without decorations. But one of them, as the inspection will later show, was not attached to the foundation. She was separate. Such findings began to occur more and more often. Walls moved, inserted where they shouldn't be. And every time, in places where historical changes took place, a change of power, epidemics, exile, a hypothesis arose. These walls were not architectural, but ritual elements, created not to separate space, but to shift perception. In Rome, the term pares vivus, living wall, existed. Ego was used by priests, talking about parts of temples that were not subject to transfer, decoration, or description. They could not be touched. They knew where they stood. So they said in the Chronicles. This is not a metaphor. Perhaps certain parts of the architecture were perceived not as stone, but as active elements of interaction with the sacred field. The Romans believed that a place is not a point on a map, but an attitude. And if you change it, not by moving it, but by taking it out and inserting it again, you can also change what is happening there. Similar rites are described in priestly treatises, but only partially. One of them, found in Fazina, speaks of the displacement of the corner inside the axis, after which silence will begin and then the walls will leave. In practice, this may mean a demand for physical editing of space, as if a building is not an object, but a carrier of state. The most mysterious walls are found in suburban villas, often in bedrooms or basements. They stand out acoustically. The sound goes there as if absorbed. When scanning, it turns out that such walls have a non-uniform internal structure. In one case, it was found that inside it consists of alternating layers of brick and unknown powder, possibly of volcanic origin. But the main thing is that GPS does not work in these areas, and the magnetic compass is distorted. Even in the 21st century, devices record temporary discharge. One of the Roman philosophers of the 2nd century, Cornelius Frontus, wrote, "A wall that knows its role is silent, but if it is placed where it does not belong, it will begin to speak through the silence." What did he mean? Perhaps it was about the ancient tradition of movable architectural elements that could be used in rituals as a kind of seal. Not doors, not secret passages, but semantic barriers that denote the beginning of the second zone. In the magic of late Rome, the concept of limes mutatis, shifted border, is known. This is a border that no longer fixes a physical division, but separates states of reality. Modern theorists assumed that such walls were used in the rite of iter reversum, reverse journey. It was believed that if a person passes through a certain sequence of premises, the space begins to recognize him. But if there is a special wall in the way, a walking one, it can stop this process. Not like a castle, but like a forgotten one. After it, the memory is erased. Some associate it with the experience of soldiers who, returning from certain regions, could not remember the route back, although they walked along it more than once. One of these walls of memory was unearthed during excavations in Salerno. During the request for its transportation, a collapse occurred. Inside is a niche filled with copper tablets with engraved symbols, none of which have been identified. They were not letters. They were like variations on forms, circles, intersections, loops. Later, art historians recognized that this is an architectural language created not for things, but for impact. What if such walls were part of a system where architecture is not just a physical environment, but a mechanism for retaining knowledge, inhibition, and transformation? And if they walked, perhaps not physically, and in the sense that they left the world when they were no longer needed, or when they became too dangerous to stay put. Underground cities of Rome. The underground architecture of Rome is often talked about. Catacombs, aqueducts, drainage tunnels. All this is fixed, measured, classified. But sometimes in these systems there are sections that no one created, but which definitely exist. The buried tunnels leading to nowhere. Cameras that do not have an architectural function. Rooms in which there are no signs of life, but there is an echo of presence. It was first discussed in the 16th century when the architect Antonio da Sangallo described the strange dungeons under the Aventine. He wrote about corridors going deep underground, without branches and ventilation. In one of them, he heard an echo that was not there. The stone seemed to buzz, as if a second sound was embedded in it, stuck in the void. Later, this complex was closed and was no longer mentioned. Modern archaeologists recognize that part of the underground systems of Rome has not yet been explored. Some old maps show areas marked as sub terra incerta, undefined underground. They are not connected to the water supply, they are not connected to the sewage system, but they are. The so-called zero halls are especially strange. These are cameras that do not have a functional input. You can get inside only after the wall is destroyed, and every time they enter there, it turns out that the room is absolutely clean. No garbage, no traces of life, no organics. Only a smooth stone, often polished with the correct geometry, sometimes with unmarked stone platforms, sometimes with niches in which there is nothing. But the most frightening thing is that the sound disappears in these halls. There were several cases when trying to install acoustic equipment inside, the recording came out empty. The microphones registered only the background noise before the entrance to the hall. Then silence. When it comes out, the signal is normal again. One researcher described it this way: it's not the absence of sound, it's a room where sound doesn't start. Documents from the late antique period have been preserved, which speak of sealed vaults, allegedly created with the participation of priests. These vaults were not repositories. They were called places of coincidence, points where the lines of the passage of time, the passage of thought, and the paths of souls intersected. Pseudo-Hermopius writes, "There are cities above the earth. But there are others the same, only they are not connected with the body, only with memory." The discovery of a huge underground hall was recorded in the Vatican area as early as the 19th century. According to the official version, it is a fragment of a Roman warehouse. But the dimensions described in the report are amazing. 72 meters long, 18 meters high, the walls are lined with stone that is not typical for the region. The object was soon walled up. The reason is danger of collapse. But no photos were saved, only sketches. On one of them there is a ladder going down to the floor. On the second there is a symbol on the wall, similar to an inverted triumphal wreath. In some texts, this symbol is called the crown of absorption, a sign that closes the course if it should not be opened. There is an opinion that there were double levels of the city in Rome. One is physical. The second is an architectural layer, built not for life, but for harmonizing what is happening above, like a filter. A layer of silence between people and those below, or higher. In one of these spaces, under Conciliatore Street, in 2009, a niche was discovered in which there was a stone with a carved date. Only the date was in the future. DCCXL 7 AUC, 847H from the foundation of Rome. This corresponds to the year 94 of our era. The problem is that the stone was buried in strata dating back to the 1st century BC, as if he was there before he was created. Some call it a coincidence, others, violation of the time sequence. The third is a relic of a structure that does not follow chronology. If under Rome there is a system that perceives not only the movement of bodies, but also the meaning of what is happening, then the question is not who built it, and in the fact that it is overwritten when the world above it begins to change. These underground halls are not locked. They are like frozen breathing, like silence between heartbeats. We are used to thinking that architecture is physics, but perhaps Rome knew. Architecture is also a memory, and while it is not destroyed, something in it still remembers. Places that are not on the map. One of the strangest phenomena associated with the history of Rome remains the so-called silent zones, areas that are mentioned in ancient texts but do not coincide with any modern location. These are not just mistakes of ancient cartographers. These are spaces whose existence is confirmed through repeated descriptions, but which seem to have disappeared not physically, but conceptually, as if a certain location were removed from general perception, leaving only a trace in the memory of the sources. An example is the mysterious Oppidum Tertium, the third fortified point mentioned in several military chronicles of Trajan's time. He appears as a connecting link between 2 legion camps in Germany. The reports indicate that reinforcements came out of it, it received the wounded, and there were warehouses in it. But there is no third Oppidum on modern maps tied to these chronicles. He left no archaeological traces. Field diaries mention it, but not a single GPS survey records either the foundation or traces of activity. As if he was recorded, but not material. Such repaid places are found even closer to the heart of Italy. There is an area in the Lazio area where local residents warn, it's best not to come here with a compass. There, compasses do not work, phones lose charge, and sounds are muffled. One geophysicist, who tried to conduct measurements, later said, "When I entered, I realized that I was not going to the forest, but to the memory of the forest. It was as if the place itself knew that it should be forgotten." In some late Roman sources, such areas are called regiones remisse, released regions. The wording is ambiguous. Released to whom and why? Some historians assume that these are territories removed from the general structure of the city, deliberately removed from symbolic geography, perhaps due to the fact that something happened to them that could not be recorded in the annals. Or, on the contrary, it was recorded too literally. In one of his letters, Seneca mentions a place where every word becomes a trace. He does not explain where it is, but adds, "And therefore we do not return there, so as not to be read." If you take this idea literally, perhaps there were points where the very presence was fixed, not in space, but in perception. It was impossible to occupy such places. They could only be felt and forgotten, or leave it without a description. There is a map of the beginning of the IV century, preserved in the Vatican archive, on which 7 circles are recorded beyond the borders of Urbis, the central part of Rome. Each circle is marked as presentia sine forma, presence without form. There are no roads or topographic marks nearby, only circles. Researchers call this an attempt to map not physical objects, but nodes of meaning, places where a failure occurs between what is and what seems. In the Capua region, in the middle of the 20th century, during the construction of the highway, a failure of equipment was recorded on a section of 60 meters. The bulldozers stopped working. The construction markings moved every day, although it was driven into the ground anew. Finally, the site was bypassed. Later archaeologists came there and found nothing. No foundations, no layers, only densely compacted soil. But one of them wrote, "When I stand in the center, it seems to me that the air is denser, and if I close my eyes, I am not standing here." Such places were probably part of the second level of the urban structure, not built up, but muted. They were not designated, kept, or deified. They were points where it was impossible to say, "I was here," because this here did not retain its form. It returned to itself. It is interesting that in late Roman magic there was a ritual called locatio mentis, binding of the mind. It consisted in directing thoughts to a place that did not physically exist, but which, according to the priests, could be opened inside. One description says, "When you reach a point that no one has drawn, you will understand that it was not you who took the step, but she." What if these silent zones were real, but not in the usual sense, not tropes and walls, but structures of perception, hidden between the layers of the urban body. And if you got there, you didn't notice. He simply left and forgot, and the place continued to wait. Words that should not be spoken. In Roman culture, the word had power, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. A word is an action. A word is a will that has crossed the border. A legal formula, pronounced aloud, began to work, even if it was later cancelled. The oath was binding. A curse is a weapon. The empire lived in a world where speaking meant appealing to the structure of reality itself. But there were other words. That was not recorded. What was not said. Or on the contrary, they were pronounced only once, and never again. They were called verba arcana, secret words. They had no public use. They were not taught in schools. They were not pronounced at forums. They belonged to a temple, a ritual, a certain moment. Some of them were sacred names of gods, not intended for everyday use. For example, Jupiter, according to several sources, had an inner name that only priests knew. Ego was pronounced once a year during a closed ceremony. If it was not pronounced by the one who is responsible, it was considered that the name hears it and the thing turns inward. No one knew exactly what it meant. But in one document there is a description of a priest who lost his voice after a ritual in which the voice broke. Execratio formulas are another example. These were not just curses, but structured texts carved on lead tablets, rolled up and buried under places of passage, intersections, stairs, doorways. But in some cases, these texts were written in reverse, from right to left, sometimes without vowels. They were not meant to be read. They were intended to activate the space. One archaeologist wrote, "It's not a message, it's a slider. It's like someone starts a process but doesn't wait for a response." There were also such words that were considered anchor. They tied a person to an event. In one sacrificial ritual, a formula of 3 words was used, which was forbidden to be repeated. If you said them, it was considered that you were getting in touch with the action, and even years later, everything that happens according to this formula will resonate with you. One of the sources cites a case when a person who uttered such a formula after 20 years suddenly began to speak in an unknown dialect at night in a dream with the same phrases. The later magical tradition includes the concept of impressio verbalis, voice imprint. In Roman demonology, it is believed that certain words are not pronounced out loud, not because of superstition, but because they are imprinted in space and begin to be repeated. Not like an echo. And what's the point? They respond with other events. Someone said them, and then a few weeks later, another person suddenly says the same phrase. I don't know, but I sound with the same intonation. On the wall of one Mithraeum there is an inscription, Noli loqui in memoriam, don't speak in memory. The meaning of this phrase is still controversial. Some believe that this appeal does not speak about the dead. Others, that the speech is about prohibiting the creation of new memory nodes with words, as if the speech could connect you with things that should have been forgotten. There was also such a concept as a word without a carrier, a word that passed through a person, but does not belong to him. Such a word could be written down, but it was not understood. An example is the tablets from Umbria, which contain phrases that are not found in any other text. Researchers cannot decipher them. But the strangest thing, some of these phrases later appear in the folk magic of the Middle Ages, almost unchanged, as if they were not transmitted directly, but lived in the structure of the language, appearing where they are needed. Psycholinguists call these semantic relics, echoes that are not fixed in meaning, but operate at the level of structure. Perhaps in Rome, this was understood intuitively. And then they created dumb language zones, areas where a word could not be repeated because it did not belong to the world of people. It was like an instrument. It was used and then removed. And if you accidentally pronounce such a word, not because you learned it, but because it came, perhaps you become not its bearer, but its conductor. Glass which should not be. We are used to perceiving glass as a material that appeared in antiquity in a primitive form. Amphorae, vessels, display cases. The Romans really mastered the craft of glassblowing. Their products are still found all over Europe. But among the archaeological finds there are such objects, the origin of which cannot be explained either by the technology of the time or by the logic of purpose. This is a glass whose properties contradict both chemistry and history. In the 1930s, while excavating a villa in the Tivoli area, researchers found a fragment of a material similar to glass, but with an unusual density. It was not transparent, rather translucent, with a metallic tint. Laboratory analysis revealed that its melting point exceeds 1400 degrees. For the first century of our era, this is an impossible level, but the main thing is that when exposed to light, the material began to resonate, does not glow, do not reflect, and to give a weak vibrational response as if something was resonating inside it. Later, in other places in Italy, glass objects were found, the shape of which did not correspond to either utilitarian dishes or decorations. One of them is an elongated disc with symmetrical holes arranged in a circle. At first glance, it is a lens or element of optics. But the material had a strange feature. It absorbed light completely. Even with strong illumination, the beam did not penetrate inside. Only a dull glare remained, as if you were looking not at an object, but at a black eye. Roman sources refer to a special category, vitrum obsidianum, black glass, born from fire, but not amenable to repetition. In one of Pliny's texts, a case was described when a material formed during a volcanic eruption, in which you could see not yourself, but what you think. An apt metaphor or something more? Vaguely. But the very fact that the glass was perceived as a border between the visible and the other already speaks of its special status. The most disturbing are objects that, judging by the descriptions, changed shape. There is evidence of a flask in which the water does not move, even if it is turned over. Perhaps a closed glass vessel in which something greater than physics was happening. Or the layer in which the picture changes, even though it is not drawn, is like an ancient kaleidoscope. Or something more serious. In one of the Roman tombs, opened in the middle of the 20th century, a round glass dome covering the head of the deceased was found. He was hermetically sealed in the sarcophagus. On the inner side of the ego, there is a grid of microscopic grooves. When it was photographed at a certain angle, it turned out that the pattern coincides with the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. The find was recognized as an artifact without a function, and was soon lost. Some believe that glass was used not as a material, but as a conductor, that through him it was possible to see not only light, but also meaning. Perhaps these were tools for ritual focusing of perception, or, as some esotericists believe, gates of attention, through which it was possible to come into contact with things that are not usually visible. On the walls of one of the Mithraeums, the phrase was found, "Quod luce non est," that which shines does not exist. Some interpret this as a paradoxical statement about the illusory nature of the visible. But perhaps we are talking about the properties of the material. Perhaps the ancient Romans were not looking for an image in the glass, but what replaced it, the echo of the second glance. The strangest thing is the traces of impact from these objects. There are reports that researchers who worked with such artifacts experienced headaches, sleep disturbances, and sharp memory loss. None of these glasses have survived in museums. Almost all of them are lost. Not a single full exposure. Only black and white photos that do not convey textures. If we admit that glass is a film between worlds, then the question is not in technology, but in intention. Why did the Romans create such objects? To look through them, or that something looked back through them? And if one of these objects is found today, and someone shines a light on it, it is not a fact that he will see a reflection. Perhaps he will see what he was waiting to see from the other side. Mirrors of Rome. Mirrors in antiquity were not as common as in later eras. The Romans used polished bronze, silver, and sometimes obsidian. They reflected vaguely, often murky, but at the same time they carried something more than just an image. A mirror in Rome was not an everyday object. It was an instrument of the border, an object that not only returns the gaze, but changes it. And in some texts it is directly stated, the mirror knows not only who is looking at it, it knows when. Magic mirrors in the Roman tradition are an infrequent but persistent topic. In the writings of Pliny the Elder, a speculum consecrantum is mentioned, a consecrated mirror into which one could not look for more than 1 minute. It was allegedly used in rites of augurs when reading heavenly signs in a closed room. It looks like an ordinary silver disc, but according to legend, the reflection in it delayed, as if the image was not copied, but was delivered from somewhere. And if you hold your gaze, you can see not what is in front of you, but what has already happened, or will happen. Some mirrors were found in burials, especially in tombs where not priests were buried, but architects, topographers, and geometers. At the same time, the mirrors themselves were not decorated, had no signatures, and always lay face down. In one such tomb, found near Arezzo, on the reverse side of the mirror was carved the phrase, "Respicere non est videre." Look is not to see. But the strangest things were found not in tombs, but in sanctuaries. Inside a temple dedicated to an unknown god in northern Italy, archaeologists discovered a system of 3 mirrors aligned along the east-west axis. When a ray of sunlight passed through a slot in the wall in the morning, the reflections were superimposed on each other and hit the stone slab. No image appeared on it, but it was beginning to show moisture. The pattern that appeared in the fog repeated the geometric pattern carved on one of the Mithraeum altars in another region, in Dalmatia. It is difficult to talk about coincidence, but there are reasons to believe that the mirrors were used as connecting structures between remote temples. Perception in antiquity was not divided into material and spiritual. Everything was one field. And if a reflection appeared, it was perceived not as an optical phenomenon, but as a reaction of space. There was also a belief that some mirrors hold the name. If a person looked into such a mirror for a long time during the ritual, his name remained in the depths of the reflection and could be restored by the priest if it was necessary to summon a spirit. This is not necromancy in the usual sense. This is a semantic imprint fixed not in words, but in the structure of the look. According to one of the hypotheses, mirrors in Roman temples were not used for images, but for coordination of ritual times. Each reflection is not just a returned image, but a displaced moment. And in theory, if you build reflections in the correct sequence, you could see not the past and not the future, but the possible. Some late philosophers called it ordo visibilis, order of the visible. This concept includes the idea that the world is not one, and that each view builds its own version. Mirrors, especially in ritual constructions, could be an instrument of convergence of views, in which the event occurred only when it was reflected twice, outside and inside. A strange device was found in one of the temples on the territory of Numidia, a chamber with 4 mirrors lined with a smooth black stone. No windows, no pictures on the walls. Inside, silence, in which everything sounded wrong. When the researcher entered there and turned on the weak light, he saw his reflection, but it did not move. A few seconds, and only then did the ego catch up, as if the mirror was waiting for a command. If you take it not as an illusion, but as an effect, then perhaps the Romans used mirrors as tools for adjusting events. Not magical, architectural, simple in form, deep in impact. And then it becomes clear. Mirrors in the Roman tradition are not images. These are surveillance structures that can work both ways. And maybe when you look at one of them, the question is not who you see, and whether it sees you back. Silent inclinations. There are places in Italy that seem to escape attention, not because they are hidden, but because nothing lingers in them. We are talking about the so-called quiet slopes, landscape formations associated with ancient roads, pilgrims' paths, or areas where temples once stood. But unlike other memorial points of the Roman Empire, these areas cannot be retained in memory. They are described, photographed, marked on maps, and forgotten again, not literally, and as if the territory itself repels attention. The first mention of such slopes is in the writings of the Roman geometer of the 1st century BC, Marcus Vibius Livius. He described a part of the earth where shadows do not move in the direction of the sun. At that time, it was considered an optical illusion. But later, in medieval chronicles, similar descriptions appear. Sections of roads where horses stop, birds do not sing, and the sounds of footsteps disappear. On the map is an ordinary place. In reality, there is a spatial pause. Modern archaeologists attribute this to geology, underground voids, magnetic anomalies, vegetation features, but local residents say otherwise. There are rumors in the villages that they don't hear prayer on the slopes. You can't read out loud there. Words do not bounce back. People lose their orientation. There were cases when groups of tourists who passed through such a zone could not remember the exact moment when they left, not because they got lost, and because the event smoothed out. An altar was found in one of these places, on the border of Lazio and Umbria. No inscription, unadorned, just a stone block perfectly cut into the slope, surrounded by 3 indentations, similar to footprints. But not human, too long, too smooth. Nearby are drawings, circles, waves, spirals. It looks childish, but they were dated to the 2nd century, and most importantly, the altar did not cast shadows. We are at the same time of day. In another case, near Naples, a courtyard without sound was discovered. This is a ruined building dating from the late Republican period. 4 walls, no roof. Inside, the floor is made of black tuff, perfectly smooth. And if you enter there, the voice goes out. Not a hum, not an echo. namely sound absorption, as if in a soundproof studio. But there is an open area around, not a single technological trace. On the wall is a phrase, almost indistinguishable, hic nulla vox revertitur. Here not a single voice returns. There is a theory that the Romans deliberately created such zones, not for housing, not for worship. And how are places of erasure, points where something is erased that should disappear not physically but by meaning? They were not cut down, built up, or destroyed. They were simply not touched, because they knew, if they intervene, what was forgotten can reveal. Some philosophers of the Stoic school said that space has its own expression of will. It allows or rejects not depending on people, but on correspondence. And if a person is not in his place, space does not record his presence. That is, he is there, but he does not leave a trace, as if he passed through. As another phenomenon may be related to this, the absence of archaeological layers. There are regions where there should have been traces of life, roads, trade, caravans, but there is nothing. Only a grassy surface in which the ground-penetrating radar detects voids. No bones. There is no coal, no debris, as if no one had ever stopped here, even if the text says otherwise. Roman engineers knew how to build in any terrain, but nothing was built in these places, and this is also a choice. There were lands that were not cultivated, not because of poor soil, and because it wasn't fixed there. The wording is strange, but it is repeated in several Latin sources. Modern observations show that antennas, towers, and concrete structures do not take root in these areas. The coating disappears, concrete cracks. It is as if the material itself is pushed out of the environment. And if we accept that this is not mysticism, but some ancient principle, then it becomes clear. Rome not only created peace, it left voids in it. Not mistakes, not abandoned. And cut-out pauses are places that speak not of what is in them, but of what is not happening in them. Maybe something is still heard in these areas, not with the ears, not by voice. An inner knowledge. It is not necessary to be here, and maybe precisely because there was something here, something that should not return. Negotiators. As is known, the Roman Empire was fought not only on wars, but also on negotiations. Diplomacy, bribery, secret agreements, all this existed long before the emergence of medieval political culture. But in addition to the usual functions of ambassadors and governors, a special category of people is mentioned in the Roman system. They were called interloqui, literally negotiating. But what they were doing had nothing to do with diplomacy in the usual sense. Only a few mentioned have survived. They are fragmentary but repeated with frightening accuracy. One source describes interloqui as those who can talk to walls. The second is as intermediaries between the center and those outside the roads. The third reports, when there is no more formula and the words are not accepted, he comes and does not speak from himself, but speaks to others who are nearby. Who are these others? Where are these walls? What is out of the way? There are no answers. But it is known that interloqui acted in situations that the Romans called perturbatio rerum, disruption of things. These could be epidemics, uprisings, natural anomalies. But in some cases, the disappearance of populated areas, mass deviation of rituals, nights in which morning did not come. At such moments, neither soldiers, nor priests, nor engineers were called. Ego was called out, one or two. People who didn't do anything with their hands, but after them everything took shape again. Sometimes interloquis were called silentari, bearers of silence. In one rite, described in a treatise of the 4th century, it is said that such a person must walk along the perimeter of the affected territory, without uttering a word, looking only ahead and returning exactly the same way. Not a step to the side, not a look back. It was believed that he picks up a failure, as if a violation in the structure of the world can be closed back through human attention. Were they priests? No. Ordinary priests acted as part of the temple ritual, and interloquis came to places where the church was not working, where words were no longer spoken, where sacrifices were not accepted, where the air remained motionless even in the wind. In the description of the fire on the Capitol Hill, a figure is mentioned who came without a name, but in clothes they did not know. He did not interfere in the extinguishing. He stood and watched, and the next day the fire stopped without explanation. The Chronicle says, "And then they understood not all fires are extinguished with water." Later, in the Christian era, these figures became associated with danger. In some monastery records, They are designated as walking between times, and the monks tried not to notice them. It was believed that if you enter into a conversation with such a person, you will begin to hear phrases that do not belong to you, and one day you will say something that you did not decide to say. Physically, the interloquies are described as ordinary men, often in dark clothes with a quiet gait. But one element is always repeated: they never had a permanent home. After completing the task, they disappeared. In some records, he dissolved around the corner. In others, he was known by his presence, but not by his face. An interesting case from Britain, where an almost undamaged parchment was found during the excavation of an old Roman fort. On it is a speech that someone wrote down from memory. It begins as an ordinary statement: "You called me when the wall stopped listening." And then there are incomprehensible phrases. The third line is shaking. The left wheel is bleeding. Put it back, but not under you. No one knows what it means, but the last line at the bottom is written in a different handwriting. He left, and now we see the house. There is an assumption that the interloquy did not solve the problem. They restored symmetry, sometimes at the price of knowledge, sometimes at the cost of time. If all that is happening is the structure, then the failure in it may not be eliminated, but negotiated. Not literally, in the sense of rhythm. And these people were like resonators. Becoming part of the distorted, they took on the tension and introduced the ego. Some researchers believe that the followers of interloquy could survive until the late Middle Ages, dissolving into the figures of dumb advisors, transient sages, those who were just around. They left no traces, only calmness after the presence. And if somewhere in a modern city you feel that the situation has smoothed out for no reason, and you remember a face you don't remember, perhaps he was nearby. Walls with rewritten inscriptions. Rome was a civilization of inscriptions. Stone tablets, marble fragments, bronze boards, everything was fixed. Names of emperors, laws, dimensions offered to the gods, list of consuls. But among these official inscriptions, others are sometimes found. Not reflecting events, but as if inserting new ones. They are called inverse inscriptions, texts that appeared on an already known wall later, without changing the traces of carving, but changing the content. As if someone did not cut the stone, but rewrote the meaning. The first documented mention is a column on the square in the Forum Boviaria. In the 17th century, scientists recorded a Latin inscription on it, beginning with the words Pro Gloria Eterna. 100 years later, upon re-examination, the beginning already read Pro Memoria Arcana. The stone did not change. The letters are the same, but the wording is different. Later, early engravings were found, where the old text is clearly visible. Contemporary photos show another. No restorer has officially worked with the object, but the wall itself seems to have been renewed. In the crypts in the north of Rome, there is a fragment of a fresco on which is written, Hic scriptura non manet. The inscription is not preserved here. For a long time, it was considered that this is an artistic metaphor. Until in 1998, one researcher noticed that the phrase on the wall had disappeared. Then she returned, but already with the second arrangement of letters. One gets the impression that in some places the text is not engraved, but inscribed in the structure of reality, and its reading depends not only on the eyes. In one Mithraeum, a rite was described where the participant had to walk along the wall with closed eyes and name the words that came to mind. The texts, pronounced by different people in this place, coincided in meaning, out of shape, but according to the direction of thought, as if the wall itself led a person to a certain formulation. A round room lined with marble was discovered in southern Italy. In its center is a pedestal. No windows, no doors. Inside, everything is covered with inscriptions, but they can be seen only at a certain angle of the light. In normal lighting, the surface is smooth, but if you light a candle and rotate it in a circle, words begin to appear, and each reading is different. Photos fix the text. But if the person returns after a day, the letters in the photo and in reality do not match. Some philosophers of late Rome called it the living word of stone. The theory was that certain objects are not just carriers of information, but active editors. They do not preserve the text, they reflect it like a mirror, but not visually, but in a meaningful way. And if you approach with the second condition, you will see the second text, not a metaphor, and letters. A text attributed to a monk who converted from Catholicism to Gnosticism was preserved in the monastery archive of the 13th century. In it he writes, I entered the hall where the wall knew my name. It was not written, but it sounded in me. And what I said was not my words, but what should have already been said. Official history rejects this, but scientists notice repetition. Certain Roman walls repeat words that are not written. One experiment in 2003 tried to verify this. In the Roman vault, where the inscription was previously lost, several researchers worked in turn for a week. All of them independently began to write the same formula. In different words, but with the same meaning. No one suggested, but the wall dictated. Can it be said that the Romans knew about it? It is possible. There are texts that describe the act of revios silenti, rewriting silence. This is not a ritual, but a state in which the place itself renews in itself what was said, leaving only the essence, changing the form. This is not an erasure. This is dubbing. What if certain buildings in Rome were built not only from stone, but also from repeating structures? What if, entering them, a person faced not a reflection of himself, but a text that was always waiting to be pronounced precisely through him? And if one day you find yourself in a place where the inscription changes at an angle, where the letters waver in the darkness, where the thought comes to awareness, maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe you entered a memory that can speak and was waiting only for your tongue to speak again. Formula outside the city. In the vicinity of Rome, outside the usual urban layout, there are old roads that do not lead to settlements. They do not coincide with military routes, do not go to ports, do not repeat the trajectory of aqueducts. These roads end in nothing, an open field, a forest, a hill, but they were not built by barbarians. Masonry, engineering calculations, style, everything points to the Roman origin. Question: why? In the archives, they are known as viae conclusi, closed roads. The wording is strange. How can the road be closed if it is built? One of the early sources indicates that such paths were intended not for movement, but for pronunciation. What this means is not explained, but in several documents the phrase is repeated. After passing the last cross, the word is heard differently. Some believe that these roads were used for pilgrimages in the opposite direction, not to the temple, but away from it. In Roman mysticism, there is a well-known ritual called regressus, a return to the starting point, not in space, but in meaning. A person, having passed such a path, as if he were closing his own trajectory and, according to belief, could close the loop. Archaeologists who investigated one of these roads in the Sutra area found that the last 300 meters of paving differ in composition. The stones are denser, the sound of footsteps is muffled, and the compass deviates slightly. On both sides of the road are the remains of low walls with mica inclusions. No text explains their purpose, but next to it is a stone with the inscription verbum ibi figitur. It translates as, "the word is fixed here." A word is not a name, not a formula. The word as essence. It is possible that the record was meant, not in letters, but in body. A person, having crossed the road, left not himself, but what was uttered in him, even if he was silent. There is a hypothesis that such roads led to the points where the Romans did not perform rituals, but the consolidation of reality. In one treatise on magic, the term ordo restituendi is described, the order of restitution. He did not have a fixed formula. It was not a text, but a state achieved through movement. Perhaps passing a certain route with an inner intention overwrites the event, not in the past, but in the ego effect. In 1972, a group of researchers found 10 identical stone slabs along one of these roads, each of which had an engraving, a wavy line leading into a spiral. None of the symbols had signatures, but if you arrange them in order, there is a feeling of a repeating sequence, as if the road itself was a reading. You don't walk on it, but it reads you. In late antique literature, there is a mysterious text attributed to the poet Junius Sylvanus, in which he describes the path without a goal, leading to the name. He writes, "I didn't know where I was going, but when I stopped, I realized the whole path was a word, and now, standing on it, I am its last letter." This is not a poetic image. This is a structure in which the root becomes a sentence, and the movement becomes a grammatical action. In Roman religion, movement was not separated from meaning, and perhaps certain roads were active texts intended not for the feet, but for the activation of what is outside the words, as if by walking through it, you were completing a process that began long before you were born. Finis non hic was found near one of these roads. The end is not here. Some read this as an indication that the path continues, but there is another interpretation. The end is not in space, and that's what you have to understand before you get there. And if you don't understand, the road is not finished. What if the Romans built not only cities, forums, and temples, but also meanings spread out in space? What if the road is a formula, and the stones are its letters? And if you walk on such a road with the right intention, it reveals what is hidden not even from the eyes, but from the course of time itself. And perhaps it was on such roads that formulas were born that were not written down in books. Formulas that stood up in reality and changed the trajectory of events. The city that cannot be named? Rome is called the Eternal City, but in some late antique texts there is a mention of the Second Rome, not Constantinople, not a mythical prototype. And the city, which cannot be marked on the map, but which, according to some philosophers, moved together with the present, not casting shadows. Ego was called in different ways: urbs interior, speculum urbis, domus muta, inner garden, mirror of the city, dumb house. This is not a metaphor. In some priestly treatises, it is directly stated that some of the rituals were performed not in a physical place, but in a repeated form. It was not about a temple, not about a symbol, but about a structure into which people entered mentally, but from which they left changed physically. There is a fragment of a letter from a late Roman senator to an unknown addressee. He writes, "I found an entrance. This is not a door. This is a rejection of the road. When I stand at the right point, the city responds. Its streets are not noisy, but they are remembered. Its temples are not called, but they are followed. And if you say its name, it will disappear. That is why we do not call it. We simply return." What is this place? Did it literally exist? Or did the Romans realize that some forms do not need matter to function? That a city is not walls, but an order of thoughts, which can be tuned so that only the necessary events take place within it. And then the Rome we know is not the only Rome. This is the outer layer, and below it is a city built of gestures, names, roots, words that cannot be repeated, and when the temple was destroyed, it did not disappear. He switched. The entrance to it is now not under an arch, but in a pause, in silence, in the mirror in which you cannot be seen, but you feel that you are being seen. If you collect all the oddities found over the centuries, non-working doors, statues without faces, walls without meaning, roads without an end, texts without letters, you can see not fragments of the empire, but the framework of a second city embedded in the first. He is never mentioned out loud, but it repeats itself, in every ritual, in every formula, in every stone that cannot be explained. He was not invented, he was admitted. And maybe what we thought were remnants are not ruins. These are traces of care, because that city did not burn, he disconnected. He moved to the second dimension, not up, not down, but to the side where everything continues, but without us. In Roman philosophy, there was a term relicta orbis, fallen peace. This is not hell, not nothingness. This is something that is no longer fixed by the structure of reality, but still exists as a possibility. Perhaps Rome left behind just such a trace, and therefore he is eternal, not because it was not destroyed, and because everything we find says that it is not finished yet. We are used to thinking of Rome as a completed chapter of history. Chronology, architecture, emperors, fall. Everything is clear. Everything is documented. But the deeper we look, the more attentively we listen to the silence between the columns, the more obvious the second thing becomes. Something remains unfinished. We saw roads that lead nowhere, but as if waiting for steps. Temples built without gods. Walls that speak only in the absence of things. Glass that reflects not the shape, but the intention. Texts that change at a glance. And names that disappear not because of time, but because of attempts to pronounce them. Perhaps Rome was not just a city, it was a system of adjustment, not of the external world, but of what is between us and them. And when we encounter the inexplicable in this story, we do not discover something new. We only come across something that has not yet been completely erased. Empires crumble, cities are extinguished, books burn, but the structures remain. They cannot be destroyed because they are not made of stone. They are in the roots, in gestures, in lines that are repeated throughout the ages. And maybe we are not looking for ancient Rome. Maybe he is looking for us.